Right now, it's an exciting time to be an X-Men fan. What with the iconic 1997 animated series getting a revival, and the upcoming Deadpool-Wolverine team-up flick, that seems to be a love letter / FU to the entire Foxman universe. So I figured, what better time than now to re-emerge myself in a lifelong fandom. But before I get to the original X-Men the animated series, I'd like to first take a look back at its predecessor. Pryde of the X-Men was a planned series that would follow a young Kitty Pryde as she joined the X-Men, which checks out, it's kinda all there in the name. The show was never picked up, but a pilot for it does exist. Unlike a lot of the other TV show pilots I usually cover here on the channel, this one actually aired. And from what I can see, it was met with generally mixed to positive reviews. It received mostly warm reception. So much so that it kinda went on to inspire a couple of other X-Men related projects that we'll get into in a little bit. I'd always heard echoes of this show, but never took the time to watch it before today. I'm actually a little bit bummed out that this didn't wind up making it past the pilot, because this show showed some serious potential. First and foremost, this is beautifully animated. The characters are cleverly designed, and most of which have a look accurate to their comic counterparts at the time. The voice team is full of talented people who suit the roles that they're in, for the most part. And it even has a pretty solid opening theme. In a short time, this pilot manages to do a whole lot. This episode does a good job at conveying anti-mutant rhetoric. The ways in which people speak about mutants with such disdain and disgust, referring to them with slang and what in their world is the equivalent to slurs. All of this shows the serious prejudice the public has toward mutants. It properly portrays the characters and their allegiances, showing that society's view on mutants has separated the mutant community into two separate parties. There's the mutants who want to prove humanity wrong and peacefully coexist with the people, and the mutants who want to prove humanity right and eradicate their oppressors, and anyone who looks like them as well. Of course, it's all very simplified here, but I think it gets the job done. While things are dumbed down and softened up, I think regardless it gets its plot across. It explained its lore in an engaging and entertaining way, provided unique visuals, and gave a decent enough introduction to some of the X-Men's most iconic characters. All things considered, it honestly seemed to have a pretty good grasp of what the source material was, though it's clear that liberties were taken in certain areas. Once again, we'll get to that later. It served as a solid introduction to the mutants, their powers, their motivations, their beliefs, and just who they are in general. This pilot did all of that in under 24 minutes. Now granted, we don't get an intimate knowledge of the heroes or villains, but we do at least get an impression of the characters. The team consists of the usual suspects, some of the brand's most famous mutants: Wolverine, Cyclops, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Storm, and most surprisingly, Dazzler, a character who doesn't get all that much love outside of the X-Men comics. As a matter of fact, I believe still to this day, this is the character's only official on-screen major outing. Yeah, she's appeared in other things, a playable character in the games, a millisecond cameo in one of the movies, and even a small role in the animated series. But this is the only time that character's ever been a main character in a lead X-Men. Despite dealing with some pretty heavy themes, the show is still camptastic. It's this weird mix where the show wants to take the material seriously, but it doesn't want to delve into the darker and edgier side of those stories. Which is fair given the time period this came out in, as comic cartoons were typically handled with kid gloves. This pilot is light for the X-Men, but it's also significantly more mature than a lot of the other superhero shows that were out at the time. Without a doubt, this is leagues ahead of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. The pilot also sees the team make their way into space, which is something all too common for the characters from the comics, but not nearly as common for the X-Men outside of those comics. I think there's really good adaptations of characters. Magneto and Professor X both feel pretty on brand, although Magneto does feel a little bit too ready to brutalize his brethren, which seems odd coming out of a character that is so pro-mutant that he has to by nature be anti-human. Though I guess that kinda was also a problem with the character in the comics as well. Characters like Storm come off strong, and even little Lockheed gets some love. He doesn't get a name, but he does at least make an appearance. It's sad because this never-would-be show does have a lot of charm to it. It even starts off with an opening narration by none other than Stan Lee. Long before this man was making cameos in his creation's live-action adaptations, he was acting as the voice for these cartoons. Though what he says in his narration is a little bit confusing. It's almost as if he's telling the audiences to be on the lookout for mutants as they're all to be feared, which is weird when the whole point of the plot of your series is to tell people that mutants are just humans too. The series also follows up the Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends trend of making Wolverine Australian, because this was apparently a fad at the time. Those aren't my words, by the way, those are the internet's. It's also stated that there was some intent on turning Wolverine Australian in the comics as well, but like how? Was that just going to be some part of his second generation mutation? He goes to sleep a Canadian Wolverine and then he wakes up as the Wolverine from down under?
Look at her, wait, she's not joining the X-Men, is she? She's just a kid. Wait till I get my claws on him, he'll be talking out the other side.
Look, I could go on forever about how this didn't work. But to keep it short and sweet, the voice just doesn't match the character model, or even the character in general. No disrespect to anyone, but an Australian Wolverine would never work. Except for that one time, where it did for 24 years, but aside from that, though the accent isn't the worst part of this version of the character, the fact that he's made completely unlikable is. Which, listen, I get. Wolverine has always been written as being hard to love. But this Wolverine is impossible to like. He goes beyond being a grumpy loner. Here, he's just a mean-spirited prick. Simply put, Wolverine.
You're a dick.
Like many X-Men adaptations, this show makes the decision to turn the Juggernaut into a mutant, when in the comics he's actually just a giant dude empowered by a mystical gem. Although, unlike a lot of other iterations, the show didn't forget to make him Charles Xavier's stepbrother. Regardless, seeing him work side by side with Magneto does feel a little bit off, just because Marco is supposed to be human and Magneto loathes humanity as a whole. Not the greatest pick for the Brotherhood of Mutants. Another member of the team that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me is Emma Frost. Now, Frost is no stranger to villainous mutant teams, but in the comics, it's not the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants that she's a part of, but instead the Hellfire Club. Outside of these two new questionable inductees, the team consists of mutant leader Magneto, Pyro, Toad, and the Blob. Though in the comics from the time, if I'm not mistaken, many of these team members didn't even team together, with most being associated with the Brotherhood at separate times, with different leaders. Magneto and Toad were from the group's original incarnation, but Blob and Pyro came later during Mystique's takeover of the team. Though all things considered, I'm not really mad about mixing and matching members here. If you're starting a fresh canon, you might as well take the elite and make a dream team. There are a couple characterizations that I call into question here. Like Nightcrawler, for example. He can come off as creepy. I don't know if the intent was to make him a creepier version of Pepe Le Pew, but I'm gonna be honest, he kinda comes across as just that. He's still as clever as ever, mind you. But when he's first introduced, he talks about how beautiful Kitty Pryde is.
What a lovely vision you are. Please allow me.
Professor?
Come on, Kurt, that's just not a good look. Still, outside of this very odd creative route, Nightcrawler does somewhat feel in line with his comic book counterpart, acting selflessly and noble, even almost sacrificing himself to save the humans that hate him. Cyclops has 2 red dashes for eyes in his ruby quartz visored monocle. And yes, that's what it's called, I looked it up. I don't know, that just seems like giving him eyes but with more steps. Just let the man wear the VR headset, it's fine. Much like his run in the live-action films, here he's given very little to actually do. Cyclops seems to always be the most underappreciated character in every adaptation of the X-Men. I really hope we see a change for the better in the future, but I also know better than to hold my breath. I take some issue with the way Toad is depicted here, as he's made an Igor type. Not only is he completely subservient to Magneto, but he's voiced by an actor who's impersonating Peter Lorre throughout. I could see why maybe they'd go this route, there is some merit to it. Toad is certainly one of the less handsome mutants, and he's definitely subordinate to the mutant leader. But this just feels a step too far for me. I think this is a little bit too on the nose. I've read a couple of reviews for this over the years that claimed Kitty Pryde was a total damsel in distress. And while they're not entirely wrong, because that does sort of seem to be her role here earlier on, by the end of the episode she's accepted into the X-Men for her own heroic actions. While it's not entirely comic book accurate, I do think having her start off as a naive, uneducated damsel in distress helped ingrain the audience in the show. First-time X-Men watchers are learning along with the character. It gives a narrative reason for the world around them to properly be explained. Her needing to be saved also makes sense as she's early into her power development, and she hasn't joined the X-Men, so she hasn't yet been trained. She barely knows how to control her powers, and she's surrounded by people who have already mastered their own. Honestly, I don't see that being a real problem here. Her role in this is quite similar to Jubilee's in the animated series. There's an argument to be made as to whether or not this version of the team is connected to an already established continuity, as Spider-Man and his amazing friends from a few years prior brought the team in on a couple of occasions. A team which, as I previously mentioned, also boasted an Australian Wolverine.
How you doing? Want a piece of fruit?
But there's a couple discrepancies with that established canon that just don't really check out here. As in that show, they mentioned the Juggernaut's original origins, ergo the character not being a mutant, and Kitty Pryde also made an appearance on one of those episodes, whilst this is shown to be her first time on the team. Not to mention that there's no returning cast. Well, I guess that's not entirely true, as the voice of Colossus from Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, John Stevenson, would come back to voice Professor X in Pryde of the X-Men. So I don't know what the official ruling is on this one, if it's connected or not, but I personally wouldn't treat this as canon to anything, really. But what I find most interesting about all of this is despite the fact that this series was never picked up, it did see some spin-off material. This short-lived show got its own toy line, believe it or not, and much more famously, it got its own video game tie-in 3 years later. And I also think X-Men the Animated Series seemed to take some light inspiration from this. And speaking of X-Men the Animated Series, if that's something you'd be interested in seeing me break down season by season, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
Get with it! The X-Men don't have room for whiny brats!
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.